Thank you, everybody. Perfect. There are the slides. Thank you all for attending part two of our session, part one having been yesterday. And I'm going to jump right into it at this point in time with a quick introduction of myself. My name is David Ricciardi. I'm President and CEO of Proximo. We are an LGBT/BE and also disability certified. We deal with data and analytics, which is my area of expertise. And as you can see from the slide up here, I've been doing that for more years than I care to count at this point in time. Have been working in a lot of different industries, doing a lot of different things. But of a particular focus is the experience that I and we have in supplier diversity data. Educating, analyzing data, leadership positions across a few organizations over those time periods. And really what we're going to be talking about today is supplier diversity and the intersection of data. Let's see. There we go. Just keep going. So let's talk a little bit. We're going to spend most of the time today, or at least I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about spend analytics. Spend analysis, when we talk about spend analytics, it's really a lot of, it's something that everybody does. It's really like a baseline. It's not the only way to measure how you're doing in your supplier diversity program. And I'm going to go through a few of the other ways in which we can do that as well. But first, we're going to focus on spend, since I would say, it's conceptually understood by everybody. When you say you're spending so much with diverse suppliers, people understand what spend is. And it's easy to do, sort of. It sounds like it might be an easy thing to do, but there are a couple of nuances which we're going to hopefully educate on in the next few slides. I know, taking a look at some of the folks that I see here as attendees, I can see some of you have done this for a long time. Some of you have done this with big programs. And for others on here, you may just be in the early stages of a program or haven't been doing it that long, or maybe looking to do it in upcoming years. So some of this will be a little bit more relevant to you. I will say as I go through this, if anybody has any questions, we have Heather Cox over here, who is yes, there you can see her wave. She is moderating, so she'll call out if there are any questions to me, and we'll be taking a look at that. But we're happy to handle this kind of on an interactive basis. And there we go. So let's just talk about some very simple numbers. These are intentionally designed to be very, very simple and straightforward. But let's say we're dealing, what are our inputs when we talk about spend diversity? First, of course, you're talking about what's my total spend. So in this case, let's say we're dealing with $50 million. We've already taken out payroll from that because payroll is not money you're spending out on vendors. It's obviously more of an internal line item. And then out of that 50 million, you've been counting and you say, well, I've spent 5 million with diverse suppliers. 5 million divided by 50 million, 10% diverse spend. Easy, right? Yep, that's simple math. That is accurate math. But we are missing one important input into the process. And that is the concept of exclusions. Exclusions really help us determine what we would refer to as addressable spend. And oops, there we go. Addressable spend, we have a very simple diagram over here. If you're dealing with all the spend we've got, you're always going to exclude portions of your spend, and that will give you the addressable spend. If you think back to what we were just looking at where we, did the division, that 50 million, we're not going to use all 50 million in the denominator. We're only going to use our addressable spend. And so when we talk about something like that, the question is, well, what are exclusions? What do I exclude from these calculations? And, here we've got some common exclusions and things that, we feel are never excluded. Now, even these lists, are a little bit debatable. And I'm going to get into some of the things that you would consider when you make your own determinations. And kind of inherent in that statement is the fact that there is no exclusive, 100% right way to do this. If you look across a variety of corporations, we've seen corporations count in different ways. Sometimes they do it because they've got good reasons. Sometimes it's the way they've always done it. There's a number of things that go into those considerations. But unlike, having like a clearly defined government regulation, for instance, or a worldwide practice like the generally accepted accounting principles gap. This is the way we always report, revenue and profit and stuff like that. With supplier diversity analytics, it's a lot looser. So while there are what we think are best practices, which is what we're about to tell you right now, you will see different people do things in different ways. So when we talk about, exclusions, on the left side, you can see a number of things that often fall into that exclusion category. Taxes is one thing that, pretty much, nobody debates. You do not have an option when you pay your taxes, be they to a city, a province, or to a country. You don't have the option of paying that to a diverse supplier. So those really come out of that all spend number. Other things that are very common, and there are airlines. You might do a lot of corporate travel, a lot of airlines, and as much as I might want to fly a diverse owned and operated carrier, there are none that we know of. So all your air travel commonly comes out as an exclusion. Utilities, by and large, utilities are, companies, private or public owned, that are providing, your gas, water, electric. There are some, in a given local market, there may be some diverse options where there's a wholesale arrangement, and some of those wholesalers that are acquiring from the utility may be able to then resell to you, and they are a diverse owned business. So that's one of the things where it's commonly excluded, but you may have diverse options in a specific local market.
David,
and another thing that, yes.
We have a quick question about the exclusions. I want to jump in really quickly.
Go ahead.
If they have an airline or a landlord operated by a minority vendor, can they count that as addressable spend?
Yes, and that's what I would say. If you've got an option that is a valid option for your company, then I would say it is addressable spend, because you have the opportunity to utilize a diverse vendor in that space. And I believe one of the key words there is appropriate. So, using that, the example, let's use landlord, because I was just about ready to get to that one. Like, let's say, you're a large company and you've got, a need for, 50,000 square foot of space. That's not even that much. Let's say 500,000 square feet. And, you're in a particular city. That's where your headquarters is. There may be diverse landlords around that you could acquire from, but if none of them have 500,000 square feet, you really don't have a diverse option. Using a diverse supplier. This was said yesterday. I believe Heather said this at the end of our session 1 yesterday. Having a supplier diversity program doesn't mean you bring down the standards of what you need. If you need something, then you go ahead and you acquire from those people that can bring you those services. So if you have a diverse option for a landlord, then it's your addressable spend. But if you need 500,000 square feet and there's nobody that's diverse that's providing that, then I would actually argue that could be reasonably excluded and taken out because you don't have the option. Conversely, on the other side, things that are rarely or never excluded, staffing companies fall into that. There's a lot of diverse staffing companies that are out there in the market. Very often accounting firms, you can find diverse options there. There's a lot of facility management companies that are diverse, owned and operated. And car transport is another example, different than airlines, where there are no diverse airlines, but there are a lot of car transports, black cabs that you can pick up in a number of cities. Some of them are even national, that you can utilize on an enterprise basis. So really, it comes down to you and your company and looking at your footprint and your market, determining what you are going to exclude and what you're not going to exclude. But once you have that list of exclusions, then you can kind of go back to your math and say, all right, I've got 50 million. But when I've looked at everything, I'm excluding 10 million that I really have no opportunity to spend with a diverse vendor. And then I've got that 5 million still with diverse spend. But when I do the math and I take out the 10 million, instead of 10% diverse spend, I've got 12.5% diverse spend. So the concept of exclusions is something that's very important when you do these calculations. And with that, I'm going to segue onto kind of like the other part of this topic. We've talked about the exclusions. The all spend is pretty obvious. But when we talk about, all right, what's that diverse spend number look like? Then we really have to get into the definition of, well, what do we call a diverse supplier? And we touched upon this through a number of topics that we talked about yesterday as well. But I'm going to kind of bring it from that conversation yesterday to what we're talking about now when we're talking about certifications and self-certifications, and how do we use that to actually manage that diverse spend number. So one of the key questions you're going to ask yourself is, for our company, are we going to only accept third-party certifications, or are we going to allow suppliers to self-certify? So we have our recommendations, our advice on best practices, and that is to use third-party diverse agencies in all cases, like a CGLCC and WEBEC and the other ones that are available to you. But there are a few other things to consider when you're going through this. And I've kind of put a few bullets up here about what we recommend. First and foremost is really certification availability. If you're looking at a diverse category that your company feels is important and you want to track and give opportunities to through your supplier diversity program, you have to look and say, well, is there a certification agency in the market I'm dealing with that will provide me with that third-party certification? That's obviously one of the big drivers. If you're dealing with a group that there's no agency for, self-certification would be your only option. But the other ones that are a little bit not as obvious, I think, are consistency. We do not recommend that you say, well, we're going to provide for third-party certifications. We want to do that all the time. But this company is one of our big vendors and they don't have a certification, so we're just going to take self-certification from them. When you become inconsistent like that, it becomes difficult to, when you provide a number for everybody else, to really understand what that number means. So consistency when you deal with supplier diversity data, technically when you deal with any data, is very, very important. Having a consistent definition that you can draw upon and communicate clearly to other folks, that's an important part of this process. Another thing that you would take into consideration about whether you accept third-party certifications or self-certifications is, what do my customers want? What are they asking for? What do they do? And the idea behind this is, there's a lot of growing talk about tier 2 spend. Bill had mentioned a little bit about this yesterday, but if you have a customer, a large customer of yours that has a supplier diversity program, and they are counting their diverse spend, it is likely that they will, at some point, if they're not already doing it, come to you and say, we value our relationship with you, one of our big suppliers. We want to know what you're doing on the supplier diversity front. And aligning with your customers is often a good practice, because when you are reporting numbers to them, your numbers will align with them. And we often see there's some commonalities in various industries. So if you were a pharmaceutical company, you might see one thing. If you're a financial services company, you might see another. But kind of knowing what your customers are doing in this space it helps inform what you might want to do in this space as well.
David,
yes,
there's a question that came in.
Go ahead.
Only because it's so timely that I just don't want to wait for them to go. So we have a question that says, is it acceptable to report certified and self-identified spend separately?
Mm-hmm. I think it is. And that's, I'll go back to what I said before. There are best practices. There are things that are commonly done, but there's no set of rules like when you're doing supplier diversity, this is the only thing you're allowed to do. So you could do that. And we have seen customers where they say, here's my certified diverse spend, and then they'll measure, it could be called a few different things. I generally call it classified spend, classified suppliers. Bill used the term qualified yesterday. Suppliers that are eligible for certification, they are diverse, but they don't have an actual certification from a third-party agency. You could break those numbers out separately, provide them together, break them out. And that does help with the consistency aspect because you're not conflating two different numbers, okay? And Heather, you're absolutely right. You know, if they are eligible, right? You've got, when you're counting those self-identified, they still need to be eligible by what you would consider them a diverse supplier to be. But that you're just talking about them not being certified through a self-service agency. Third-party agency, excuse me. Hopefully that answered the question. And then the last thing I was going to say on this is the documentation aspect of it. You know, documentation is important in terms of having a trail about how you got to a specific number. And you know, we see it a lot in the U.S. where we talked about this yesterday. There's a robust government reporting system in the U.S. and Canada is not there yet. If it gets modeled off of anything like what happens in the U.S., they've got the ability. The government has the opportunity, the ability to come in and say, "Well, you've reported that you're doing, you know, X dollars with women-owned businesses, small businesses, minority businesses. Prove it to us." And you've got to really provide them the backup documentation for all of that. So that's an example where you don't want to just be able to give numbers and then not prove how you got that. You would want to be able to pull the documentation, the third-party certification documents for all of your diverse suppliers, or if you're doing self-certified, really like an affidavit from the supplier saying, yeah, I'm diverse. This way you can say, this is why I counted them. They told me they were diverse. I also say that this isn't necessarily something you only do because it may be a government rule. I would say this comes from any key stakeholder that you're interested in satisfying. You may be building a supplier diversity program and you know, the CEO has authorized it, but you know, a year later you come back and he's seeing numbers, you know, he or she is seeing numbers floating around. Hey, we're doing 12.5% with diverse suppliers. Yeah, can you prove those numbers to me? You don't want to, at that point, go back and realize, oh, you don't have the documentation, you can't prove it. You want to really have this kind of built in, this documentation tracking process that supports your spend numbers from the beginning. When the CEO is asking you, it's already a little too late to kind of go back and make sure you've got everything in order. And a little bit then about tracking certifications. So again, this is something that we feel are best practices that you want to take a look at doing. So first, tracking diversity across all the classifications on a per supplier basis. I mentioned that documentation before. If a supplier, if you're utilizing a supplier and they say, yes, I'm certified through CGLCC, they should be able to provide to you a copy of their certification, you know, with their expiration date, so you know it's still valid as of today. And, you know, part and parcel with that is also your suppliers may have multiple certifications. Both Heather, Bill, and myself, we all have multiple certifications. There are a number of suppliers out there that do. I've known suppliers that have 3, and in a few rare cases, they have like 4 different certifications, diverse certifications. And you want to be able to recognize each one of those certifications for different reasons. And really that comes down to how you're doing your counting, how you're doing that spend reporting. If you're dealing with a supplier that, say, is a woman-owned business and a minority-owned business, and you're spending, $50,000 with that supplier, you don't want to double count that in your totals and say, well, it's $100,000 to spend because it's $50,000 twice. If you had enough suppliers, that fell into that dual certification category, you would wind up with over 100% diverse spend. So you only count it once when you're doing your total aggregate spend counting. But if somebody comes to you and says, how much am I spending with women-owned businesses? you want to have visibility and say, I've got a supplier with dual certification. I'm going to count them in women because they are a woman certified business. But if somebody else comes to you and says, I want to know what we're doing with minorities, you want to count them over there too. We have seen customers, usually I would say it's a system limitation. Although I never like to have technology be a limiting factor. In some cases, we have seen it where a company has said, our system only supports one certification. We can only put in one category. And so what those companies wind up doing is they create a hierarchical system. And they say, all right, if you're minority-owned business, we count that. And if you don't have that, then if you're a women-owned business, that's the code we plug in, and on down the line. And what you wind up having is you show your accurate numbers for whatever you put at the top of the hierarchy. But if women certified businesses are the second category, you're undercounting in that because you've eliminated certain people that have that dual certification. And so if at all possible, we recommend standing up a platform where you can actually do that counting, because you're going to have different constituent stakeholders where you're going to want to report accurate numbers per diverse community. So really having visibility into that, we feel is an important part of the entire supplier diversity process. Yes, I'm reading some of the stuff that's going on in the chat. Luckily, I know I can count on Heather. If there's a question, she will she will call it out. So now I'm going to kind of segue into just a couple of things. These will be my last couple of slides, but I'm going to get off of the spend and analytics and go on to a couple of other topics. And I will say one of the things I want to talk about here is return on investment. Now, there aren't that many companies that we know about that are really calculating an ROI on supplier diversity. However, it is possible. And I think this is, for a lot of the folks that may be here on this, on this call, it may actually be good. I think our history of supplier diversity, say in the US, where it's driven by a lot of government factors, where the government's counting spend. So therefore, people wind up counting spend. And if you're just starting a program now in Canada, you have the opportunity, I think, to kind of look at it in a different way and say, well, we're not just counting spend for the sake of counting spend. One of the things we want to be able to measure is what's the impact of a supplier diversity program on our internal company. And there's a calculation here, and this is like an investment calculator, basically the same way you might, measure the ROI of any investment you make. But it's really looking at how much revenue do you attribute to your supplier diversity program divided by the cost of running that program. And so let's just run through a couple of quick numbers here. Let's say you're, at a company and you're looking at it and you say, well, I'm going to attribute $5 million of our revenue to having had some sort of influence from our supplier diversity program. Where you're likely looking for those is where you're likely looking at those are you're looking at customers that you have that have a supplier diversity requirement from their vendors. And that's really where you're going to get a lot of those numbers from. But you're also going to apply what we call a contribution factor to this. And the contribution factor is an indication that, out of all that $5 million in revenue from those customers, we can't say that 100% of that is due to supplier diversity. They chose our company because we're the best, we're the fastest, we've got the right product, whatever it happens to be. Contribution factor generally ranges between 1% and 5%. It's basically of a given contract, what percentage of it are you saying was influenced by the fact that we have the supplier diversity program? And here I'm just using for illustration purposes 5%. So what we're looking at is the 5 million. We're taking 5% of that 5 million. We subtract out the program cost and divide by the program cost. That's the factor. And what we're saying is for that 100,000, we got a return on investment of 150%. Doing something like this and putting it in place begins to make the supplier diversity program look like a possible profit center and not only a cost center. which can be very important to your stakeholders and those that are underwriting the budget for the supplier diversity program. Yes, Heather. If anybody doesn't, right, exactly. If anybody has any questions on the math, please feel free to ask. And to answer, I do see the question there on the contribution factor. That is really a judgment call. I would say what you're saying is 5% is probably on the higher end. If you've got an engagement with a customer where that supplier diversity program was really integral, they asked for it, they want you to report maybe as part of that contract your diverse spend numbers. And maybe you look at it and your competitors weren't able to do that, and that's one of the things you brought to the table. You might choose that higher number. 1% number would be used for those where, maybe it's a line in the contract from the customer, yet we want you to have to engage diverse suppliers, but they really didn't ask a lot of questions about it. You would probably use something on the lower side. So it's a judgment call, kind of where you put it. You might look at your customer base as a whole and just pick a number and apply that to all of the contracts that have those supplier diversity requirements. But the 1% is the minimum. That's where we feel that's where if you get that customer that has talked about it, but hasn't given you a lot of actual hard requirements, you make that more like the 1%. So you do get to pick the contribution factor. Hopefully that explained that question. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Good. And then I'm going to kind of close out here with the last topic. And I'm going to go over this one at a very, very high level, but, a 301 impact analysis. Bill had mentioned this on yesterday's call a little bit about the impact in diverse communities. And I'm going to go over this at a very, very high level. It's a little bit more advanced in a way. And I know I could talk about this for a whole hour by itself, and I'm not going to do that to anybody here. But I will call a quote. We have one of our customers, a large, global company with a very large, well-respected supplier diversity program. And their supplier diversity lead, started coining this new phrase last year, which I really like. And he said they're trying to change the company culture to going from counting spend to making spend count. They had a lot of focus on just dollars. We're going to more and more dollars to diverse businesses, which is fine. It gets you somewhere. But eventually you might want to look and say, the reason we have these programs we are trying to have a positive impact on these diverse communities, these various diverse communities, whether they're people of color, LGBT or Alaskan, indigenous. You want to look at what you're doing within those communities. So what does the spend actually do? What's the impact it's having? Is it creating jobs? Because jobs, wages and wealth follow jobs. So being able to say, we have 5 million in diverse spend, or 5 million, 50 million, $500 million, whatever it is. How many jobs are being supported in diverse communities? That's one way to take a look at it. You may have different suppliers with different profiles of employees, and you might have a diverse-owned business that maybe doesn't have a lot of diverse employees. So how many jobs are you actually creating in those diverse communities? When you've got a handle on the number of jobs, how much in terms of wages of the money you pay out actually flows to those employees? Because those are the dollars that actually then flow into the communities where they live. And that's where you kind of talk about what the economic impact is. I spend $1 with somebody, and they take that dollar and then turn around and spend it at the local dry cleaners, local restaurants, at the movie theaters. They buy clothes. They send their kids to school. All of that sort of stuff is really how you want to measure that spend in different ways. That often tells a more enlightening story than just, we spent $5 million. If that's kind of your story, the story doesn't go much further than that. That's as much as you can kind of tell. This adds a lot of depth to it. And I do see this question here from Amit, so I will attempt to answer that, because that's my next slide. Actually, is, are there any questions? There may not be an accepted way of doing it. That, with a lot of the things I think I've talked about here, there's not a global recognized definition that gets used. When what I'm describing here in our methodologies and the experience we've had with, a number of large multinational companies that are working on this kind of thing, you do want to frame the conversation around things that you're able to measure, and that's why I talk about like jobs and wages here. Because those are things that are easy to measure. When somebody talks about somebody having a job or what salary they're being paid, everybody understands those concepts. And you can easily, as a human, if you're telling that story about that impact in terms of jobs and wages, people can imagine what impact that has in communities. If you say, within a given community, we've got, $10 million that are paid out to wages. People think in terms of families. And that kind of keeps it away from what might be a more nebulous discussion of impact. Because if you're talking about impact on it could be anything from health income, to political inequalities and stuff like that. Those are things that are tough to measure. And since I'm talking about measurement and analytics here, we intentionally try to frame it out as something that is tangible and understandable. So I don't know if I gave you a good explanation on that, but that is the way we frame it out, and we think about it to kind of make it very relatable to everybody. Mm-hmm. And are there any other questions from anybody else before I turn it back to my esteemed colleague, Bill?
Esteemed.
Esteemed, yes.
Love it.
All right. If anybody does type any more questions, we can answer them throughout or at the end. So, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I so appreciate you coming back. Thank you. We're going to talk today about a variety of next steps. We talked yesterday about methodology. We talked some about a background, some of the definitions that we use when we're talking about supplier diversity. We also talked about certification. And then this afternoon, now we just finished a great presentation on spend. Spend is a very important topic, and spend is probably the single biggest area that pitfalls of a budding supplier diversity program can manifest themselves. So before I do, let me just tell you a little bit about me for those who didn't hear it yesterday. So I am the founder and president of SourceOne Innovations, and we're a supplier diversity and a supplier development consulting firm. We work with all types of companies, large and small, in helping them either create or enhance their programs. I came to supplier diversity or to going into private practice after 30 years being in corporate America and being in procurement and supplier diversity. While there, I created and led a program for a pharmaceutical company, and I became very well experienced in the topics that David had talked about relative to pharmaceutical, not pharmaceutical companies, but government agencies and the types of reporting that are necessary to satisfy the government as far as your intention to purchase from small and diverse businesses. And also a co-founder of Supplier Diversity in the Box. My certifications are LGBT business enterprise, also disability owned. I'm a certified purchasing manager, and I went back some years ago and became a certified executive coach. So when we start talking about taking all this stuff and creating a program, where to start? How do we start this program? I would like to suggest that before and even after you have your program, do some benchmarking. And by benchmarking, I mean talk to people. This is not like piling through white papers and having to decipher all kinds of huge, epistles on what, benchmarking is all about. But just talk to your colleagues, maybe within your company, maybe outside of your company, about supplier diversity. And find those companies. It doesn't have to be in your own industry, and you'll probably have better luck if they aren't in your own industry, but find those companies that really have a well-established supplier diversity program to ask them what's working. What do you like it? What should I look out for? I think that once we develop those benchmarks, for those of you who are still trying to justify it to your management, you'll have some statistics to be able to go back to them and get quicker buy-in and be able to look at a variety of things like where should our goals start? What are some of the pitfalls that predecessors that I've talked to have gone through? Challenges and how we are able to make perhaps the status quo of our organizations be less so by learning from the experiences of others. So when we talk about internal collaboration, in my opinion, there are three ultimate collaborative groups in supplier diversity. We've listed one up here already, which is procurement. Line of business is the second one, and then supplier diversity is, of course, the third. What you'll find in procurement is typically they're the folks who are developing the spend. They're assessing the supply base. They're actually driving the physical RFX document. It might be a request for proposal, inquiry, whatever it might be. And they'll help negotiate the contracts. And generally, they'll lead those negotiations, and they'll prepare and they'll execute the contracts. Very important roles that procurement folks get involved with. So where does supplier diversity come in? Well, before we talk about that, we'll talk about the line of business. Those category managers that you have within your company that are trying to identify the projects that are upcoming. They want to know what requirements are for those problems that they have. And all projects start out with a problem. It's either they need something different, they need something better, they need more of one thing. But it's the line of business that's going to help you identify upcoming requests for proposals. And when you do identify those requests for proposals, you can also insert a diverse supplier. Perfect opportunity. When we talk about spend, that spend that is under contract is spend that is kind of in limbo at this point in time because it's under contract. But working with your line of business and working with procurement to understand when those contracts are going to expire can be very helpful. Line of business is also going to give you feedback because they go to organizations, they go to outreach events as well. They're going to give you some visibility as to what they have found and who they have worked with. They're going to talk with their colleagues in other industries because no one wants that risk of using a new supplier without having some background about that supplier. So we want to make sure that supplier diversity is an equal partner to the line of business and to procurement. So we can not have to be dragged along with them, but can add valuable insights. So what do we do from a supplier diversity standpoint? Well, we coordinate with procurement and the line of business, to determine those particular spend opportunities. We can bring to the table diverse suppliers that we have come across, that have called us, that have accessed our website to express interest in our companies. And we can work together in developing how the RFP is going to come together. We could also look at those suppliers, diverse suppliers, that is, or small businesses as well, but our topic is supplier diversity, about mentor-protege programs. Yesterday, I talked about supplier diversity not being only about spend, but it be about support and development. And one of the goals that we typically suggest our customers or clients to exercise is find those suppliers out there through talking with your procurement and your line of business who have a real strategic input for your company. And perhaps they're very new to the company. They don't know the company. So maybe there's an opportunity to help develop those companies through a mentor-protege program. We can also, through our spend reporting that we're going to be able to develop as a result of having these programs, be able to give back to the procurement and back to line of business, utilization. What kind of diverse spend are we having? In which categories are we having diverse spend? Where is there more opportunities? In your travels as a supplier diversity professional, you're going to go to these outreach events and you're going to come across suppliers. your line of business and your procurement folks aren't necessarily going to see those same suppliers, and you're looking at them through a different lens. So really important that we do have that strong bond between procurement and line of business. Very critical. So now we have you have gotten approval. You're about ready to start your program. Now what do you do? Well, we have a statistic that we usually go by. And most programs, from beginning to finish, beginning to end, or beginning to go live, run between 6 and 8 months. Now, we realize that not everyone has full-time equivalents running their supplier diversity program. And I'll tell you that my experiences have shown that few people have luxury, but it's a growing in popularity, that we all have other things that we're doing in addition to these roles. So we do look at 6 to 8 months typically. Typically, a supplier diversity program from ground level up runs between 6 and 8 months. And we have about 40 or 50 different elements that go into creating a supplier diversity program, ranging from the approval of the program through discovery of spend and supply base and the like, learning about your categories, learning about the flavor for what people are thinking about, the temperature about supplier diversity. And then the final phase is execution of the program and going live. This is just a snippet. I'll be happy to send you a fuller list, but it would be a real strong eye chart if I had put it up here today. So this is just to show you some of the typical elements that go in to a program. I think it's really important when you begin the program that you look at all these elements and you list a beginning date and a start date and how much time it's going to take you. And then across the right-hand side of this spreadsheet are the variety of resources that I think you might need. Of course, the supplier diversity lead is first and foremost, but there could be resources from IT to help you get data out of your ERP system, spend data so you could analyze it. There might be needs for people in the IT sector, in the marketing sector, in the communication sector to help you write and help you transmit your change management program that we're going to talk about next. So it's always best to know what level of needs you have. I have found also that typically supplier diversity programs that utilize external to their own department resources like IT, like finance, it's typically heavily loaded in the beginning of the program when you're still trying to mine data. But that will go away, and you will find that you will need those resources less. So I usually use a good rule of thumb of 10% of any group of people's time over the duration of the program is pretty fair. Might be more in 1 week and nothing in the next week. But identify who you're going to need to run this program with you. You are not an island unto yourself, and you cannot do all these things yourself. So you utilize other folks to help you do that. We also have that red, yellow, green. I don't have any red up there, but we want to make sure that we use this document to be able to communicate to your executives and to your steering committee, which I'm going to suggest shortly, what level of completeness you have. And red, yellow, green always makes you feel good, because if you see green, you know you're in good shape. If you see red, you know that you better get cooking on the whole thing. But that's, I think, very, very important.
Bill, we have a question.
Yeah, what is it?
Is there a comprehensive guide we can refer to with regards to the project plan or a couple of case studies?
I have not yet seen any definitive studies, but you could go on to the website or to the internet and check it out. Mine has come through creating a number of supplier diversity programs and knowing what has been a success for me. And again, it's not rocket science, but unless you've done it a couple times, you don't know all the various elements that you need to have a supplier diversity program. Certainly, you can get a start from the internet. I have not read any definitive articles that list the elements as I am referring to here. I know that didn't answer your question the way you wanted it answered, but supplier diversity is, even though in the States it's been around for 5 or 6 decades, we're not just now starting to get a lot of traction, and there's more people writing about it because there's more inquiries about it versus just having the government saying you got to have a supplier diversity program. Now we have private sector companies that are saying, how much are you spending with? So from a communication standpoint, we are trying to change people's behaviors. We're trying to change their feelings about supplier diversity. We talked about what supplier diversity isn't yesterday. And one of the things that I'm finding is really a very typical statistic is that when you're communicating through what we'll talk about as a strategic change management communication program or plan, is that 80% of the job of you as the supplier diversity lead is going to be in communicating to your executives, communicating to your workforce, communicating to the most important people out there, your suppliers, about what programs and what kind of work that you're doing along the ways of being able to become a fully operational supplier diversity program. The change management plan that we'll talk about should always tie your goals of your company to your communication. The goals of the company for, mirroring your supply base to your customer base, for example, and also types of things that are important for the company and how your supplier diversity program is going to do that. There are many companies out there that appeal to greater numbers of one community than another. It's those people that we want to make sure we have clearly understood and address their needs by communicating to them. So tying the communication to the company goals is important. We strongly recommend that you use as many communication modes as possible. It might be it might be a website, it might be flat screen TVs, it might be emails, it might be desktops, it might be posters, it might be vendor fairs, which we're going to talk about too, is a really important thing to do. But we want to make sure that you over communicate efficiently with the right message. You don't want to go back and forth to people and keep bothering them because they will soon turn you off and not listen to what you're saying. But you want to make sure you over communicate. And that WIIFM stands for what's in it for me. Always when you're communicating and always when you're drafting your messages to these various, factions within your company or to your supply base, help them understand why they should care about this. Why is it important? And I'm also all about trying to, check, do the pulse checks throughout your program. I encourage clients to send out internal surveys, and when appropriate, external to their supply base. How what is your understanding of supplier diversity? What do you think about it? How are we doing? Are you getting any interest? Do you know of any diverse suppliers out there? And the goal here is to, create ambassadors and create them early on and make them lasting sources of support for your group and for your program. Change management plan. What I have found over the last several years here is that typically a change management program for beginning to ending of an initial program has about 8 to 10 elements. And typically, yesterday we talked about the steering committee and how important the steering committee is to help a new program stay on track. The steering committee is going to be a group that's going to be able to help you understand if your messaging is accurate or not, if you're hitting the target. And typically on the steering committee, you have a sponsor. And that sponsor in most companies is an executive. It could be the chief procurement officer. It could be the chief diversity officer. It could be the CEO, depending upon the size of the company. But what change management programs typically have, and we're going to review the whole list of them on the next slide, is an event. Okay, so the very first thing we want to get out is an executive message. We want our executives to articulate how important supplier diversity is to them. As we talked about it yesterday, much easier road to travel if you have your executives who are supporting you. And then we have a theme. The executive message is, hey, we're talking about a new program here. We happen to think it's a neat program. It's really good for our company. It's good for our image. It's good for our customer base and our supplier base. What is the format of that particular theme? Well, in this first case, it was an email. Some companies have flat screen TVs in their cafeterias or in their halls. Many companies don't, especially the smaller companies. But then we have desktops, we have emails, we have posters. There's a variety of themes. You, in conjunction with, I would recommend, your communications department at your company, will be really very keen in helping you chart these murky waters. I would not assume you know what the format of the message should be. You will supply to an internal group or to an external group content, and they will take that content and put it into a craftable message that you would then want to review with your steering committee to see what they think about it. What's the frequency of that message? Is it going to be once and done? The executive message typically finds its way onto the website, and it's sent out to the workforce, and it's done via emails or flat screen TVs. And the one thing that we haven't talked about, because we don't have a lot of time today, we didn't talk about the budget. But before you start a supplier diversity program, you have to have budgeting for it. And David talked about part of the ROI calculation, including what the program cost would be. But in that program cost, you want to make sure that you understand what the payroll costs are, what the cost to go to outreach events are, what the cost for vendor fairs or whatever you might do. Anything that goes into the cost, you want to make sure you budget for it. And we're getting, you're now dealing, depending on whether you're a fiscal or on a calendar year, you may be getting to that point in time now where you will be asked to put together a budget. Budgets are not difficult, especially for supplier diversity programs, but they're important to have because most companies don't put a line item there for supplier diversity unless they have an existing program.
Bill, we have a question.
Yeah, go.
And then we're giving you a little time check also. So there's some suggestions for addressing a disconnect between maybe like your US-based team versus your Canadian-based team, or how can you utilize ambassadors to bring alignment between teams within one organization?
Okay, great question. And I may have misled you on the word ambassador. We're not talking about, official ambassadors. We're talking about people who have goodwill and people who support what you're doing and people who are willing to talk about it. In the staff meetings, maybe, or around the table when they're having their lunch. So ambassadors are goodwill people who are going to push the program forward through for you. Okay? So I think this is my last slide. We're going to make it my last slide. No, we just one more slide. So we talked about the website, really important. We talked about a variety of these things. One of the things that we haven't talked about that I'm going to talk about now is the media outreach. Go to all your organizations that you belong to and see if you can get free advertising. Some of the magazines out there will give you free advertising if you subscribe. And consider having a supplier fair, an invited supplier fair where you bring in suppliers and you bring in your category managers or your leaders in the company so they can talk to them. Final slide is this, metrics. What do we do with the metrics? We need to make sure we do metrics for people so that they can understand clearly what it is that we've done. So some of the metrics that I would suggest doing is, start keeping track of all the sourcing events that have been launched since the program started. Next is how many diverse suppliers you have invited. How many of them really participated in it? How many were awarded business? And if they weren't awarded business, why weren't they awarded business? There's some very typical answers that are suspect when I see them. So spend by diverse category. We need to understand where they're spending money so we can go look at their goals and say, hey, we think based upon our research that you really have opportunities to have more diverse spend in this category. We won't talk about tier 1 and tier 2 compliance, but we've talked about a little bit. That's a future, evolution for us. But I think tier 2 is the way to go once you get tier 2 program up and running. Don't think about tier 2 until you have tier 1. And external awards. Everybody likes to get awarded, both internally as well as externally. So questions we'll talk about, but we want to make sure that you understand that we are here for you. We'll be with you should you become clients. And even if not, we'll still talk to you whenever you need to talk with us. Here's our contact information. And any one of us would be very happy to be able to talk with you and help you wherever we can. Are there any other questions you have? Put back last slide. What last slide? Okay, hold on. Okay, that one?
It's that one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, metrics are really important. And these are not so complicated, but they're really important because people, especially if they don't have a supplier diversity program, they don't know. They don't have any feel. We need to sensitize people. Okay, we have 4 minutes and I finished on time. Yay.
Are there any other questions from anybody? Give everybody a moment to type. There we go.
What are some of the suspect reasons you see for diverse suppliers not winning business? Oh, not qualified, not big enough, not competitive, too much risk. And hey, those could be very legitimate answers. But when I see it, I always want to uncover and pick up that stone and see what's underneath that stone.
Right. Yeah, that's the key point. Those are suspect reasons. They're just kind of like canned reasons as opposed to a hard, necessarily being based upon hard data.
Absolutely right. Well, I certainly have enjoyed my time the last couple of days. Now I'm going to be an attendee, and I'm looking forward to that as well. But thank you all so very much for joining us, and know that, again, we are here to help wherever we can for you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.